July 7, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. The humid air clung to the skin of exhausted American soldiers dug into their foxholes. The night had been uneasy, filled with sporadic gunfire and whispered orders. Now, as the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, the men of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division prepared themselves for what they sensed was coming. Bayonets were fixed, magazines loaded, grenades stacked within arm's reach. Somewhere down the line, Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien of the 105th Infantry Regiment checked the grips of his two Colt M1911A1 pistols, each heavy in his hands, each carrying the promise of survival. At 0445 hours, the earth began to shake beneath the sound of thousands of boots pounding the ground. From the tree line ahead rose a guttural roar, thousands of voices crying, "Banzai!" The largest suicidal charge of the Pacific War was underway. Officers led the first wave, swords drawn high, their silhouettes lit by the first pale light. Behind them surged lines of Japanese infantry with Arisaka rifles and bayonets fixed. Others carried the sidearm issued to Imperial officers, the Nambu Type 14 pistol, a weapon meant to symbolize authority but never feared for its lethality. For the Americans bracing inside their positions, this was the test of everything: courage, fire, discipline, and above all, the tools in their hands. Because when the enemy came at you in screaming waves, there was no second chance to wonder whether your weapon could stop a man cold in his tracks. The Colt 45 had been designed for this very moment, close combat where hesitation meant death. And if you want more untold battlefield stories, make sure you subscribe right now, so you never miss the history that textbooks leave out. As the first Japanese soldiers broke into American trenches, the brutal difference between the two nations' sidearms began to show. The Nambu, firing its light 8.22mm cartridge, struggled to stop a charging Marine even with multiple hits. In contrast, a single 45 ACP round from the Colt M1911A1 had the raw force to end a threat instantly. The physics were unforgiving. A 230-grain bullet at 830 feet per second, heavy and deliberate, smashing through bone and muscle without overpenetration. In that chaos, survival often came down to the weapon in your hand, and America's pistol was built to win that fight. The chaos on Saipan revealed more than the desperation of the Japanese Banzai charge. It exposed the fundamental contrast between two nations' philosophies of sidearm design. On one side stood the American M1911A1, born from hard lessons of jungle combat in the Philippines 4 decades earlier. On the other stood the Japanese Type 14 Nambu, a pistol shaped less by battlefield demands and more by bureaucratic compromise. John Moses Browning's M1911 had been crafted around a single idea: immediate stopping power. The 45 ACP round was deliberately engineered after reports from the Philippine-American War in which smaller caliber revolvers failed to halt Moro warriors charging with blades. American ordnance officers demanded a cartridge capable of dropping a man in his tracks, and Browning delivered. By World War II, the M1911A1, an updated variant with subtle improvements like a shorter trigger and improved sights, was standard across the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. Every officer, every tank crewman, every pilot trusted its 7 rounds of devastating 45 caliber force. In contrast, the Nambu pistol represented the opposite. Designed in the early 20th century by Kijiro Nambu, it was chambered for the unique 8.22mm round, light, low pressure, and lacking in punch. The pistol itself was fragile, awkward in ergonomics, and notorious for its exposed sear that sometimes caused accidental discharges. Japanese officers often purchased their own Nambus rather than receiving them as standard issue, and even among Imperial troops, it was regarded as more ceremonial than practical. In combat, its underpowered cartridge frequently required multiple hits to incapacitate an opponent, an unforgivable weakness in the brutal close-quarters fighting of the Pacific. The difference was not just mechanical, but cultural. America's industrial might allowed for precise machining, hardened steel, and a steady flow of ammunition. The M1911A1 could endure mud, sand, and humidity while still firing reliably. Japan, straining under wartime shortages, produced Nambus with declining quality, thinner metal, and crude finish. Reports from American GIs who captured and tested them often described the weapon as unreliable, with a weak recoil spring and poor performance under stress. Thus, when American and Japanese soldiers met face-to-face in the trenches of Saipan, the results were brutally predictable. The Colt's thunderous bark ended fights quickly. The Nambu's pop often left its wielder with nothing but disbelief as his opponent kept charging. To understand why the M1911A1 dominated on Saipan, one must go back to its origins. At the turn of the 20th century, John Moses Browning, already a legend in firearm design, responded to a U.S. military request that seemed almost impossible. Soldiers needed a sidearm that could withstand mud, heat, rain, and still deliver fight-stopping force in a single shot. Browning's answer was not just another pistol, it was a revolution in handgun engineering. Adopted officially in 1911, the Colt 45 became the embodiment of rugged simplicity. The recoil-operated single-action design ensured reliability under the harshest conditions. Its 7-round magazine was modest by today's standards, but each cartridge carried weight and authority. During World War I, the pistol earned its reputation in the trenches of Europe, where American doughboys used it to clear enemy positions in close combat. By 1941, the refined M1911A1 version carried subtle yet meaningful improvements: a shorter trigger, arched mainspring housing, improved sights, and reinforced grip safety. For the men issued the pistol, these adjustments translated into faster handling and greater confidence. Meanwhile, Japanese officers clung to their Nambu pistols, weapons that seemed outdated even as they entered mass production. While Browning's design had passed rigorous endurance tests, 6,000 consecutive rounds without failure, the Nambu was infamous for mechanical fragility. Its magazine spring often weakened quickly, leading to feeding issues. The small 8mm cartridge lacked penetration and impact, frequently criticized by both Japanese veterans and American intelligence officers who examined battlefield recoveries. By the summer of 1944, the difference was not just technical but psychological. An American infantryman who drew his Colt knew he had a weapon with proven power, a pistol trusted by generations of soldiers before him. For the Japanese, the Nambu was often viewed as symbolic, a badge of rank rather than a dependable combat tool. This distinction became critical in close-range encounters on Saipan's ridges and sugarcane fields. Survivors later recalled the terrifying intimacy of hand-to-hand combat when rifles jammed or bayonets locked. In those moments, the M1911A1 was the equalizer, compact, devastating, and unflinching. Browning's creation was not merely a pistol, it was an insurance policy for the American fighting man, one designed explicitly to save lives when everything else failed. The sun climbed higher over Saipan as the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War crashed against the American lines. It was not a measured assault, it was desperation incarnate. Nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers surged forward, determined to overwhelm the 27th Infantry Division in one final act of defiance. American machine guns rattled, rifles cracked, and mortars thundered, but still the enemy pressed on, leaping over wire, stumbling through smoke, and plunging straight into the trenches. In that maelstrom, the difference between survival and annihilation often shrank to mere feet. Rifles became unwieldy in the crush of bodies, bayonets tangled, and grenades proved too slow to draw. Soldiers reached instinctively for their sidearms, and here the disparity between the Colt 45 and the Nambu pistol became glaring. Eyewitnesses recalled Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien himself, firing his M1911A1s in both hands as the Japanese poured into his position. The sound of the Colt was unmistakable, a deep, resonant boom that carried finality with each shot. Men dropped instantly, momentum broken, attacks halted. The Nambu's lighter crack, by contrast, often failed to stop an advancing Marine, leaving its wielder seconds away from being overpowered. For Japanese officers, the pistol that symbolized command proved tragically inadequate in the raw chaos of trench fighting. This was where Browning's design philosophy truly paid dividends. The .45 ACP round was heavy enough to transfer immense energy at close range. A hit center mass ended aggression immediately, while the slow-moving bullet ensured minimal risk of over-penetration, an advantage in crowded, confined battles. The M1911A1's ergonomics allowed rapid follow-up shots, and its recoil, though forceful, was manageable with training. By contrast, the Nambu's weaker cartridge produced inconsistent results, and its awkward grip angle made accurate shooting under pressure even more difficult. The Americans, pressed on all sides, leaned on the confidence their weapons inspired. Many accounts describe soldiers firing point-blank in hand-to-hand struggles, where the Colt's authority meant the difference between living and dying. Japanese troops, even when determined to sacrifice themselves, were stunned by how brutally effective the pistol proved in such proximity. In the aftermath, when bodies littered the ground and silence returned, the superiority of one sidearm over the other was etched forever into the memories of those who fought that morning. On Saipan, the clash between Colt and Nambu was not simply a duel of weapons, but a study in physics. The .45 ACP cartridge embodied America's obsession with fight-ending power. At 230 grains, its bullet carried immense momentum, moving at 830 feet per second from the M1911A1's 5-inch barrel. Energy transfer on impact was brutal. Instead of piercing straight through and leaving a narrow wound channel, the heavy round deposited force directly into the target, dropping a man instantly. This was exactly what American ordnance officers had demanded after the failures of smaller calibers decades earlier. The Japanese 8.22mm Nambu round told a different story. At 102 grains and a velocity around 950 feet per second, it seemed fast on paper, but lacked the mass to deliver reliable stopping power. Its muzzle energy was less than half that of the .45 ACP. In practical terms, this meant a determined opponent could absorb multiple Nambu hits and still remain standing long enough to close the distance. On Saipan, where attackers often reached American trenches in seconds, that gap proved catastrophic. American after-action reports consistently noted the devastating effect of the Colt's round in close quarters. Marines described how one or two shots from the M1911A1 halted enemy charges immediately. By contrast, captured Japanese weapons often revealed the limitations of the Nambu cartridge. Even Imperial veterans later admitted privately that their sidearm lacked the reliability needed for decisive combat use. Beyond raw force, there was another crucial factor: consistency. The .45 ACP round, mass-produced in the millions by American industry, maintained strict quality control. Every cartridge fired predictably, every casing dimension matched perfectly. The Nambu ammunition, especially in the later stages of the war, suffered from poor manufacturing standards. Variations in powder charge and brass weakened performance further, compounding the pistol's shortcomings. The battlefield consequences were plain to see. In those frantic moments when life was measured in fractions of a second, the Colt's thunderous recoil and heavy bullet ended the fight. The Nambu's lighter snap often left its user staring in horror as his target kept advancing. In the unforgiving mathematics of war, numbers mattered, and the M1911A1's ballistics proved far deadlier than its Japanese counterpart. Weapons in war are judged not only by power, but by whether they function when everything is against them. On Saipan, the American M1911A1 earned its reputation as a sidearm that simply refused to quit. Covered in sweat, grit, and blood, it continued to operate even after being dragged through sand or submerged in the island's swampy terrain. Soldiers quickly learned they could trust the Colt in conditions where rifles jammed and machine guns overheated. This was no accident. Browning's recoil-operated design was deliberately overbuilt. The pistol's solid steel frame, generous tolerances, and robust springs allowed it to shrug off debris that would cripple more delicate mechanisms. Its field stripping process was straightforward, enabling a soldier under stress to clean and reassemble it in minutes. Veterans often remarked that the Colt always fired when it had to. a statement that became a mantra across multiple theaters of the war. The Nambu Type 14, however, was plagued by the opposite reputation. Its construction, never as rugged as Western designs, deteriorated further as wartime shortages strained Japanese industry. Late war models used thinner steel and suffered from poor machining. Reports from American intelligence noted brittle components and frequent failures to extract spent casings. The pistol's awkward safety placement made it cumbersome in a fight, while its weak recoil spring often caused feeding malfunctions. Soldiers unlucky enough to rely on it in close combat frequently found themselves with little more than a symbolic weapon. Captured examples examined after battles like Saipan revealed another flaw: ammunition quality. Japan's overstretched factories struggled to produce consistent cartridges, and cases occasionally ruptured in chambers, disabling pistols completely. American ordnance officers contrasted this with the near-universal dependability of .45 ACP rounds, stamped out by U.S. industry in staggering numbers yet still held to strict standards. Reliability was more than mechanical, it was psychological. American troops entered combat confident that their Colt 45 would fire when drawn, and this trust gave them calmness under pressure. Japanese officers, by contrast, often carried the Nambu more as a badge of authority than as a practical fighting tool. In the crucible of Saipan's trenches, when chaos engulfed the battlefield, reliability determined survival. And here, the M1911A1 left its opponent utterly outclassed. Weapons carry more than bullets. They carry belief. For American troops on Saipan, the Colt M1911A1 was not just a pistol, it was reassurance in steel. Soldiers trusted it with their lives, knowing each pull of the trigger delivered force capable of ending an assault. That confidence shaped morale in ways statistics alone could not capture. A man who believed in his sidearm fought with greater calm, greater resolve, and far less hesitation in close-quarters combat. Accounts from the 27th Infantry Division describe moments where men, overwhelmed by charging waves of Japanese infantry, held their ground because they had absolute faith that their Colt would work when rifles emptied. The sound of its booming 45 ACP echoed across foxholes, steady and authoritative, a reminder that the Americans possessed a sidearm engineered for survival. Veterans later admitted that simply carrying the Colt reduced their fear. It was a weapon they trusted to deliver immediate results. For the Japanese, the experience was starkly different. The Nambu pistol, though ceremonially important, inspired little confidence. Many officers preferred their Arisaka rifles or even traditional blades to the unreliable sidearm. Stories spread among troops of pistols that misfired or of enemies taking multiple hits and still advancing. Such doubts, whispered in dugouts and camps, gnawed at morale long before battles began. Soldiers entering combat without trust in their tools carried an invisible burden, a sense of disadvantage that weighed heavily in desperate clashes like the Banzai charge on Saipan. This difference in psychological assurance mattered profoundly. The Colt's authority gave Americans a sense of technological superiority, reinforcing the belief that their equipment outmatched the enemy's. Japanese troops, however courageous, entered the fight with a pistol that lacked both power and dependability. Even when drawn in moments of last resort, the Nambu could not erase that doubt. War is not only fought with steel and gunpowder, it is waged in the minds of men. Confidence in one's weapon shapes decisions, dictates aggression, and steels resolve under fire. On Saipan, that invisible edge tilted heavily in America's favor. The Colt M1911A1 was more than a mechanical tool. It was a psychological fortress, giving each soldier who carried it an inner strength that proved as decisive as the bullet it fired. Behind every weapon carried into combat lies an industrial story. The Colt M1911A1 did not dominate Saipan solely because of design brilliance. It triumphed because America possessed the industrial machinery to produce it flawlessly, in vast numbers, and with uncompromising quality. By 1944, U.S. factories were turning out sidearms at a scale the Axis could scarcely imagine. Colt, Remington Rand, Ithaca, and Union Switch and Signal All manufactured the pistol under contract, their combined output ensuring every officer, pilot, and tank crewman received a dependable sidearm. Each weapon was identical in function, interchangeable in parts, and supported by mountains of 45 ACP ammunition. Japanese production of the Type 14 Nambu told a harsher tale. Limited industrial capacity, constant bombing raids, and shortages of quality steel forced manufacturers to cut corners. Wartime examples of the Nambu often revealed crude machining, thinner components, and poorly finished grips. Ammunition, too, suffered from declining standards. Cases split, primers failed, and powder charges varied wildly. These issues were not abstract. They translated into real consequences on the battlefield, where a pistol that jammed or fired inconsistently could cost its owner his life. The contrast highlighted the broader strategic imbalance between the two nations. America's war machine was a colossus, capable of supplying not only its own forces, but also its allies with weapons and ammunition in staggering volumes. Japan, by contrast, struggled merely to equip its troops with the basics. Where the United States treated the sidearm as a practical instrument of survival, Japan often treated it as a symbol of rank, issued more for prestige than for battlefield performance. This disparity was clear on Saipan. American soldiers fired Colt pistols backed by an endless supply chain that guaranteed replacement magazines, spare parts, and ammunition. Japanese officers carried Nambus that, once empty, might not see fresh cartridges for weeks. Industrial strength had transformed into tactical advantage, and every pull of a Colt trigger echoed the immense machinery of American factories thousands of miles away. War is not won solely by courage or tactics. It is sustained by logistics and industry. On Saipan, the Colt 45 stood as the physical embodiment of that truth. Behind its bark was not just a bullet, but the full weight of a nation's industrial supremacy, a force that Japan's strained resources could never hope to match. On the battlefield, the Colt M1911A1 carried an influence that extended beyond physics and engineering. Its presence alone created a psychological imbalance. American troops trusted their 45 to deliver a decisive blow, whether in a foxhole, a cave, or amid a nighttime ambush. That confidence fostered boldness. Soldiers advanced, knowing their sidearm could stop an enemy with a single well-placed shot. Japanese soldiers, however, often viewed the Colt with apprehension. Accounts from survivors spoke of a weapon that roared like thunder and dropped men instantly, even through heavy uniforms or field gear. In contrast, the Type 14 Nambu generated uncertainty, even among its own ranks. Stories circulated of pistols that misfired, froze in humid conditions, or failed to chamber rounds properly. That lack of faith weighed heavily on morale. For a soldier already facing overwhelming odds, carrying a pistol that might betray him was a silent burden. Psychological warfare is not always scripted by propaganda. Sometimes it emerges from direct experience. On Saipan, captured Japanese officers were questioned about their sidearms. Several admitted they respected the American Colt more than their own weapon, describing it as a hammer in the hand of every enemy soldier. These confessions, preserved in post-battle reports, illustrated how perception can shape combat as deeply as firepower itself. For the Americans, the Colt became more than steel. It was reassurance in moments of chaos. Troops on patrol, separated from their main unit, drew courage from its weight at their hip. Pilots, forced down behind enemy lines, clung to it as their last safeguard. Tank crews, trapped in burning machines, relied on its final defense. That psychological tether, binding man and weapon, became part of the M1911's enduring legend. The Nambu, meanwhile, reinforced a contrasting sense of inadequacy. For many Japanese officers, it remained a ceremonial item more than a reliable fighting tool. To some, it symbolized authority. To others, it was a hollow reminder of their nation's industrial limitations. When placed against the Colt, it became a symbol of disparity, a tangible expression of imbalance that transcended metallurgy and entered the human spirit. In war, perception shapes destiny. A weapon feared, trusted, and respected becomes greater than its mechanical parts. On Saipan, the Colt was not just carried, it was believed in. And that belief made it a weapon of the mind as much as the battlefield. When the smoke cleared on Saipan and the Pacific campaign pressed onward toward the Marianas, the echoes of close-quarters firefights still lingered in memory. The Colt M1911A1 had proven itself not only as a tool of war, but as a symbol of American resilience. From foxholes to jungle trails, it had answered the desperate cries of soldiers overwhelmed by charging waves of enemy forces. Each heavy .45 ACP round was a reminder that survival often hinged on the trust between a man and the weapon in his grasp, the Type 14. Nambu, conversely, faded into history, not with honor, but with hesitation. Post-war analyses conducted by Allied intelligence underscored its design flaws, weak ammunition, a cumbersome safety, and fragile construction. It stood as an example of how doctrine and industry could shape battlefield outcomes. Where the United States prioritized stopping power, reliability, and soldier confidence, Japan emphasized production speed and ceremonial symbolism. The results were written in blood across Pacific battlefields. Yet, the legacy of the Colt extended far beyond Saipan. Adopted in 1911 and serving through 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam, the pistol became a fixture of American military identity. Veterans spoke of it with reverence, recalling moments when its bark had saved lives against impossible odds. It remained more than a sidearm. It became a cultural icon, engraved into films, literature, and the collective memory of American servicemen. The Nambu, by contrast, was remembered less for what it achieved and more for what it lacked. Collectors today handle them as artifacts of an empire's decline, their fragile springs and underpowered cartridges a reminder of lessons learned too late. They serve as relics, silent markers of a weapon that could not match the brutal efficiency demanded by modern combat. History rarely judges weapons solely by ballistics. Instead, it weighs their impact on morale, survival, and memory. The Colt M1911A1 endures because it inspired faith as much as it delivered results. Its steel frame carried the weight of trust, and its booming 45 rounds forged legends in moments of terror. And so, the contrast between Colt and Nambu was not merely technical, it was philosophical. One represented assurance in chaos, the other doubt in the face of duty. In that divide lay the story of 2 nations, 2 visions, and the eternal reminder that in war, belief in one's weapon can be as decisive as the weapon itself.